don't just want the news, they want the truth. What others hide, I bring to you with evidence. Politics, corruption, human rights. No filters, no fear, just facts. I don't stop until the system shakes. Assalamu alaikum, you're watching Trending Daily and I'm Makhdoom Shahabuddin. Today's episode is divided into three deeply connected segments that together reveal a larger regional truth. When power becomes rigid, when truth is treated as a threat, and when strategy is replaced by pride, systems begin to crack from within. From Afghanistan to Kashmir, and from political repression to military miscalculation, what are we witnessing in early 2026 is not isolated turmoil, but a pattern of governance under stress. Let's begin with Afghanistan. In early 2026, the Taliban regime is no longer the disciplined force it once claimed to be. Behind carefully staged displays of unity and religious authority, Afghanistan is being pulled apart by an intense internal power struggle that threatens the very survival of the regime. What was once framed as healthy ideological debate has now hardened into a structural fracture between two rival centers of authority, the Kandahar Shura and the Kabul cabinet. The Kandahar Shura, led by the Taliban's supreme leader, Haibatullah Akhundzada, operates from a worldview that treats governance not as a practical responsibility but as a divine obligation. For this faction, compromise is difficult, diplomacy is weakness, and economic survival is secondary to ideological purity. Decisions are issued as religious decrees, often without consultation, economic planning, or regard for international consequences. The Kandahar leadership believes legitimacy flows from theological authority alone, and regardless of the human cost to it. In stark contrast stands the Kabul cabinet, dominated by Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani and Defense Minister Mullah Yaqoob. These figures are not liberal reformers, but they are pragmatists. They understand that a state cannot function in total isolation, that an economy cannot survive on sermons, and that starving a population in the name of faith will ultimately destroy the very regime claiming divine legitimacy. For them, engagement with the outside world is not ideological. For them, engagement with the outside world is not ideological surrender, but strategic necessity. This tension, long simmering beneath the surface, exploded into the open in late 2025. When Haibatullah ordered a nationwide internet blackout, framing it as a moral necessity to prevent ideological contamination. The Kabul cabinet quietly but decisively resisted. The order was only partially enforced. This act of defiance was unprecedented in Taliban history. Analysts describe it as the rebellion of the ministers. A moment when the Kabul faction openly signaled that it no longer felt bound by the supreme leader's increasingly erratic decrees. Sirajuddin Haqqani went even further, issuing public statements criticizing the monopolization of power and warning that Afghanistan was being driven toward collapse. Such language would have once guaranteed swift punishment. Instead, it exposed the Taliban's new reality. The leadership can no longer enforce absolute obedience. Today, Afghanistan is effectively governed through a confusing dual-track system. Kandahar loyalists bypass the official ministers entirely, issuing the instructions through clerical networks and local religious authorities. Kabul ministers, meanwhile, retain formal titles but lack meaningful control over budgets and other state affairs. It means paralysis. No one knows which authority truly holds power or which decision will be enforced tomorrow. The human consequences are catastrophic. Afghanistan's economy has ground to a near halt. more than 17 million people face acute food insecurity in 2026. Public services barely function, salaries go unpaid, entire regions survive on humanitarian assistance that the Kandahar leadership often obstructs or politicizes. While Kandahar hardliners describe this suffering as a test of faith, Kabul warns that hunger is not spiritually purifying. It is politically explosive. As desperation grows, extremist groups like the Islamic State Khorasan are exploiting this vacuum. Recruitment is rising, funded by delusioned Taliban fighters who feel betrayed by the ideological rigidity and the lack of opportunity. Even resistance movements like the National Resistance Front are equally absorbing defectors. The very unity that once made the Taliban formidable has evaporated. Afghanistan now stands on a knife's edge. Analysts warn that this fragile balance cannot last. A formal split, a palace coup, or violent purge of pragmatists could plunge the country back into the civil conflict. Alternatively, a total victory by Kandahar hardliners would leave Afghanistan isolated economically, shattered, and governed by doctrine rather than reality. In every scenario, it is the Afghan people who pay the price. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not merely Taliban in fighting. It is a lesson in what happens when power refuses adaptability and governance is reduced to ideology. From Afghanistan, we now turn to Jammu and Kashmir. In Indian illegally Jammu and Kashmir, journalism itself has become a dangerous act. Reporting facts, asking questions, and informing the public are increasingly treated not as democratic responsibilities but as threats to state authority. What unfolded in January 2026 marks a chilling escalation in how truth is managed in this region. And the trigger was routine reporting. Journalists published factual stories about a police exercise seeking detailed information on mosques, madrasas, and their management across the Kashmir Valley. This reporting was verified, mired, and entirely within the bounds of professional journalism. Instead of clarification or transparency, the state responded with intimidation. In Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, senior journalist Basharat Masood of the Indian Express was summoned to the cyber police station in Srinagar on January 14th. He was kept waiting for nearly 7 hours without any written notice, charge, or explanation. The following day, he was brought before a district magistrate and asked to sign a preventive bond written in Urdu, instructing him not to repeat his so-called mistake. When Masood questioned how factual reporting could be labeled a mistake, the pressure intensified. Over the next 3 days, he was repeatedly summoned, spending more than 15 additional hours under questioning and forced waiting. Another journalist, Ashiq Hussain of Hindustan Times, received an oral summon to appear before cyber police. His organization demanded a written notice explaining the legal basis of the inquiry. None was provided. The journalist did not comply, highlighting the arbitrary and coercive nature of this process. At the center of this intimidation is the misuse of preventive bonds under the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Sanhita. These legal provisions are meant to prevent imminent threats to public order. Applying them to journalists transforms reporting into an act of presumed guilt. Legal experts warn that this practice amounts to preemptive censorship through fear rather than law. Signing such a bond would mean admitting that journalism itself is a threat to the peace. These incidents are not isolated. Over the past 2 years, Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir has witnessed a steady pattern of media intimidation. Journalists have been detained, offices raided, phones seized, and interrogations prolonged without charges. Each incident sends a clear message. Compliance is safer than truth. Political reactions have exposed deep divisions. Opposition leaders have called these actions as dangerous for the democracy. Ruling party representatives defend them in the name of national interest, yet offer no evidence of wrongdoing by journalists. International press watchdogs, including the Committee to Protect Journalists and the International Foundation of Journalists, have condemned the harassment and called for an immediate end to this harassment. India now ranks near the bottom of the World Press Freedom Index. Since the revocation of Article 370, Indian illegally Jammu and Kashmir has become a testing ground for modern narrative control. Internet shutdowns and overt bans have been replaced by quieter, more insidious tools: legal pressure, psychological exhaustion, and self-censorship. This is no longer just about journalists. It is about whether truth itself can survive in an environment where facts are treated as threats and legality is weaponized to enforce silence. Ladies and gentlemen, now we turn to our final segment. India's approval of 114 Rafale fighter jets under the MRFA program in 2026 is being celebrated domestically as a strategic breakthrough. In reality, it represents one of the most expensive and damaging defense procurement failures. In modern history, what is being sold as modernization is in truth a return to a deal abandoned more than a decade ago, now at nearly 3 times the cost. The estimated price tag of $30 to $35 billion makes this one of the costliest fighter acquisitions per unit in the world. Critics argue that India is paying a massive premium on pride, restarting a process that should have delivered a full fleet years ago. Instead, the Indian Air Force today operates with just 29 squadrons, far below the sanctioned strength, at a time of increasing regional tension. The delays are staggering. From the original requirement in 2007 to projected induction in the 2030s, this program spans more than 2 decades. Bureaucratic indecision, political interference, and shifting narratives have hollowed out air power readiness. Emergency purchases have replaced long-term planning, leaving the force numerically depleted and strategically strained. Even more damaging is the dependency trap. Without full access to source codes and mission systems, India remains dependent on foreign suppliers for upgrades, for maintenance, and for integration. Indigenous programs like Tejas Mk2 and 5th generation AMCA have suffered from chronic underfunding as billions flow to foreign assembly lines. What was promised as self-reliance has become technological dependence. And the opportunity cost is immense. Analysts argue that the same funding could have produced hundreds of indigenous aircraft, strengthened domestic industry, and built long-term strategic autonomy. Instead, India has chosen delay, dependency, and depletion, while paying one of the highest price in the global arms market. Veterans warn that this is not just a procurement issue, but a national security risk. A force that is numerically weak, financially overstretched, and technologically dependent cannot sustain deterrence. Political symbolism in India has replaced the strategic foresight. As we reflect on today's 3 segments, a single pattern emerges, whether in Kabul, Srinagar, or New Delhi. Systems that suppress adaptability, silence truth, and prioritize optics over substance ultimately weaken themselves ideologically without governance collapses. Security without transparency erodes. Strategy without foresight fails. This was Trending Daily, and I'm Makhdoom Shahabuddin. See you in the next episode.